Mr. Shepherd's Tavern, at the corner of Church and Broad Streets in Charleston. It had been a gathering place for South Carolina Freemasons since 1736. By the spring of 1801, Charleston was one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the young American Republic, a port city where merchants, soldiers, refugees, and scholars of different nations, faiths, and stations found themselves side by side. The Masonic lodges meeting at the tavern had already drawn these men together across boundaries of language, creed, and custom, forging bonds between the old world and the new world. In May of 1801, 11 of those men came together to build something new. And what they created has now endured for 2¼ centuries, spreading across the globe and becoming known as the Supreme Council, Mother Council of the world. This is the story of those 11 gentlemen. In 1801, the United States was barely a generation old. Philadelphia had been the seat of the Revolution, and that city, along with major other towns like Boston, Baltimore, and New York, already had burgeoning Masonic communities. So why did one of the most important governing bodies in the history of Freemasonry begin here, in Charleston, South Carolina? Economics, of course, played a big part. Charleston, at the turn of the 19th century, was a thriving seaport, its economy built on the cultivation of rice, indigo, and cotton, on a fast-developing shipbuilding industry, and it must also be said, on the labor of enslaved people.
Well, I think when you're talking about Freemasonry, you sometimes inadvertently are talking about politics, economics. And so to me, Charleston made sense at the time because it was a really big port for economic activity. A lot of shipping and mercantilism went through from Europe across the Atlantic to the West Indies and then eventually landed in Charleston. And so you get this sort of nexus of people from all around the world coming to do business and travel and meeting people from the United States, from the West Indies, from England, from all around, England, France, Germany. So it sort of makes sense that Freemasonry met there as well.
But Charleston was more than a port. From its earliest days, it had been shaped by an unusual promise.
Our holy city really was that. King Charles is sitting on his throne in London, and he's got the whole Carolina colony. It's costing him a fortune. So he calls in his lords proprietors, and he says, okay, guys, I'm going to grant you portions of Carolina. Our little patch of land that we call Charleston was given to Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper, the Earl of Shaftesbury, and he had to figure out a way to make it pay. This was a business venture. He called in his secretary and he said, what can I do to get these people to go there and settle? His secretary, of all things, was John Locke, the philosopher, who was an enlightened young man. So he wrote our first Constitution. The first Constitution guaranteed religious freedom to Jews, heathens, which we think may have been the Native Americans, we don't know, and anybody else who dissented from the Anglican Church. And from the very first day, our Constitution guaranteed religious freedom.
That guarantee drew settlers from across the Atlantic. By 1790, a large number of refugees from the slave revolt in Haiti had arrived as well. Charleston had a free public library by 1698, a free school by 1710, and a professional theater by 1735. But tolerance had its limits.
Charleston is the holy city, not because of all the churches that we have, but because of all the different faiths and religions that came here, except for one. There was actually one religion that in 1719 was outlawed, and that was Roman Catholicism. And it stayed outlawed until our Constitution, and in 1790, that law was struck down.
So Charleston's full religious diversity was within the living memory of the men who gathered in May 1801. This was a city that had learned, by hard experience, that its survival depended on people of different cultures getting along.
Everybody was working together. It was important. We couldn't survive if we didn't have this interdependence. Our economy was dependent upon us getting along with people.
So it's kind of cool to see the cooperation amongst folks a little bit in town. Charleston's got a very interesting way of bringing people together. It's kind of a cool place.
And into that mix, for more than 60 years, the Masonic fraternity had been quietly at work. By 1801, Freemasonry was not new in America. It was foundational. Benjamin Franklin had become a Mason in Philadelphia around 1730 and later served as the Grand Master of Pennsylvania. George Washington was initiated in Fredericksburg, Virginia in 1752 and later was elected Worshipful Master of Alexandria Lodge while he was president. Joseph Warren was the first Grand Master of Massachusetts, and he was killed at the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775. So Freemasonry had been a part of America since the first settlers arrived. The American Revolution only deepened the fraternity's presence. 33 of the general officers of the American forces were Freemasons. Military lodges traveled with the Continental Army.
After a time of war or some kind of great tribulation, there is a influx of members wanting to join local lodges. These men were part of military units. They had this relationship with other men, and they wanted to find the way to continue that connection with other people. And Freemasonry afforded them that opportunity. I am a veteran, served the Army for quite some number of years. Veterans are always looking for a sense of structure. They thrive in structure, in organization. And I think one of the things they find in Masonry is that structure. There's a rank system, there's a hierarchy, there are orders given to be followed. To them, it just made sense.
In the decade before the Supreme Council's founding, Freemasonry was not simply a private fraternity. It was helping to lay the literal foundations of this new republic. In April 1791, Alexandria Lodge laid the cornerstone of the District of Columbia at Jones Point with full Masonic ceremonies. In October 1792, Lodge No. 9 of Maryland laid the cornerstone of the White House. And famously, in September 1793, President and brother George Washington, wearing his Masonic apron, laid the cornerstone of the United States Capitol with a Masonic trowel and gavel. Charleston was no exception. By the mid-1700s, no fewer than 9 Masonic lodges were routinely meeting in the city.
Not only is there a craft lodge, right? You have Grand Lodge operating there in Charleston, as well as small subordinate bodies like La Candor Lodge, which is a French-speaking lodge. You also have American lodges, English-speaking lodges. You also have Scottish Rite presence and participation. So it sort of made sense that Charleston was this cosmopolitan city. There was a lot of activity going on. There was a lot of masonry going on. And you had Masons from around the world coming to Charleston for business, for work, and even for masonry. So it makes sense that Charleston really became an epicenter of Masonic activity.
You know, Solomon's Lodge No. 1 was founded in 1735. Them and Georgia at the same time, they argue about who got it first because charters were dated within a day of each other, but arrived in the port and had to be transported wherever they needed to go. So there's a fun rivalry there. Friendship No. 9 was from the 1790s, as was Washington Lodge and La Candor Lodge. couple of the 11 gentlemen were members of Friendship and of Lycander. So that's a cool link that we have in our lodge to the Scottish Rite.
But something else was developing alongside the 3 symbolic degrees of ancient craft masonry. Higher degrees, rooted in French and continental traditions, had begun arriving in the Western Hemisphere, and it was in Charleston that those degrees would find their most consequential home. To understand what happened in Charleston in 1801, you have to understand what came before it, and that story begins not in America, but in London and in France.
When the Grand Lodge, or the premier Grand Lodge, was founded in London in 1717, there were those only 2 steps or levels. They were not yet called degrees. The first reference that we have to these levels being called degrees is 1723. It wasn't until 1725 until we have our first strong evidence of the Master Mason's degree. So this was something novel in Freemasonry. And only a few years after that, we know that by 1733, there was another level or degree added, or that was being conferred in London, and that was called the Scotch or Scots or Scottish Master degree, however you want to call it. The traditions of that degree are extremely important to what we consider high degree Masonry, or anything that's above the degree of Master Mason.
From that single degree, a more elaborate system would grow. Despite the name Scottish, the higher degrees did not originate in Scotland. They developed in France, where they accumulated layers of legend, philosophy, and ritual. By mid-century, a structured system of 25 degrees had emerged, known as the Order of the Royal Secret, and one man would carry those degrees across the Atlantic.
Yes, Stephen Moran, he's one of the most important peoples in high degree Masonry. I like to refer to him as a Masonic adventurer. There have been a few of these in the history of Freemasonry, and certainly he's one of the most successful. He received the Scottish Master degree in 1744, and he takes this degree and really sees the potential of it. It's like really the foundation of all these other degrees, as I've mentioned in the past. But what happens to Stephen is really interesting. He gets taken as a prisoner of war twice. He's taken back to England, where he is introduced to the English Grand Master of what we would say the modern Grand Lodge, or the original Grand Lodge. And he's allowed to visit Masonic lodges. His patent is looked at, and it's endorsed by the Grand Master, who says, you can be my representative in the New World. So he comes back to, he's a merchant, comes back to the West Indies, and he sets up lodges. And when he, again, on his travels in the 1760s, he's again taken a prisoner of war. And so these things actually benefited him, because he has authority from both France via a patent that he received, and from the English who had endorsed his patent, to kind of shape the way that Masonry is going to be. Now remember that this is a time when it takes a long time to travel. So if you're going from the West Indies to Europe, it's going to take you a fair amount of time. There's not a lot of quick communication. You can't actually call up and ask, does this guy have authority? What do you know about this guy? And so what happens is, we think that he expanded his powers. There's no question that he had actually received a patent from France. But the constitutions, or the rules that he created for his latest system, or the last system, the Order of the Royal Secret, was actually based on other French documents. So he creates this constitution of 1762, and he backdates it. It's based on later French documents, but who's going to know that?
Marin's deputy, Henry Andrew Franken, carried the degrees to Albany, New York in 1767, making it the first known conferral of those higher degrees in the 13 British colonies. Franken translated the rituals from French into English and appointed a chain of deputies across the young nation. That chain of authority passed from Franken to Moses Michael Hayes in Boston, then to a series of deputy inspectors general, including Isaac DaCosta for South Carolina. DaCosta established the Sublime Grand Lodge of Perfection in Charleston in February 1783. After his death that November, the lineage passed through Joseph Myers and Baron Spitzer to Colonel John Mitchell. On April 2, 1795, Spitzer appointed Mitchell a deputy inspector general, though he restricted Mitchell from acting until Spitzer's own death the following year. But Mitchell's lineage was not the only path that led the high degrees to Charleston.
So Lochinvar was formed by French refugees from Saint-Domingue. So in 1793, during the Haitian Revolution, the revolutionaries burned Cap Francais, which is like one of the largest cities in Saint-Domingue at the time, and also the residents of both Jean-Baptiste de la Hogue and Auguste de Grasse-Tilly. It was their home place, and they basically evacuated in 1793. And then by November, one of the deputy inspector generals, Hyman Isaac Long, he's traveling around. We see him, he's up in New York, and then he's looking for some charity. He goes to Pennsylvania, he's looking for charity, and he comes down to South Carolina. Well, these French brothers receive him in lodge, and as a token of like charity, he bestows upon them the degrees from basically the 18th degree, because a lot of these guys have in the French Rite the 7th degree, which is Knights Rose Croix. So it's kind of like their system starts at like effectively what is like the 18th degree and up, and he confers these, and he makes several of them deputy inspector generals, or the 25th degree, which is the top degree in the Order of the Royal Secret at that time. Now, at the same point in time, though, that there's a body of English-speaking Masons of the Order of the Royal Secret. They are, at this point, they're only a council of the Princes of Jerusalem, but more importantly, in July 1796, their lodge burns to the ground. So the Grand Lodge, and the first 4 lodges, they're all basically homeless. And so what ends up happening is they come together and they use Lochinvar's lodge, which is at 42 Broad Street in Charleston.
Both the English-speaking and French-speaking groups were now meeting at 42 Broad Street, just steps from the building where Charleston Freemasonry had begun, both converging by the late 1790s in the same rooms among the same men. There was also a legal framework, a document known as the Grand Constitutions of 1786, which provided the authority for a Supreme Council of the 33rd degree. The constitutions have been the subject of considerable debate among Masonic scholars. Were they actually drawn up in Berlin? Did Frederick the Great of Prussia truly sanction them? Were they really even from 1786?
Yeah, my opinion is, and has been for many years, is that the constitutions of 1786 and the story of the founding of our Supreme Council by Frederick the Great can be compared with the traditional legends that we have in the Grand Lodge system, where the founders of Freemasonry are looked at as being King Solomon, King Hiram, and Hiram Abiff. It's a traditional background. It's not something that you take literally. And so my personal belief is they created those constitutions in Charleston, but they had something that they were working from.
Whatever their precise origin, the Grand Constitutions gave the founders the structure they needed. They established the offices of the Supreme Council. They defined the 33rd degree, and they gave a governing body the authority to bring order to the proliferation of high-degree Masonry.
Mitchell and Dalcho and these persons were not looked at in the same way. They did not encroach upon degrees that belonged to any other Masonic system. They preserved the Order of the Royal Secret, expanded it, and I think that they exercised their powers remarkably well.
We are called the Mother Council because we set that standard. We establish what we call the precedent for how these rules will become together, how we are formed, as well as how they're shared.
A lot of those degrees convey the same lessons in just slightly tweaked ways. And it seems that Scottish Rite really did answer that point of what it was trying to do and streamline the degrees and the lessons that we teach universally, basically across the world. I think it's kind of an honor that the 11 gentlemen were from here and they had the forethought and the wherewithal to actually make that happen. And so I think my favorite part of Masonry is the connections we make with people that we otherwise really never would have run across.
Before there were 11, there were 2. Colonel John Mitchell, born in County Antrim, Ireland around 1741, a merchant, a soldier, a magistrate, a commissioner of the Charleston Orphan House, and a personal acquaintance of George Washington. And yet, remarkably, we know very little about Colonel John Mitchell.
To me, I think John Mitchell is one of the most fascinating figures, a guy who came to the United States from Ireland, joined the Revolutionary War, was engaging and supporting the President of the United States and helping get rooms for Martha Washington when they were travel. He was the deputy quartermaster of the army. So he was dealing with the logistics of moving materials and supplies around. And so he became someone that General Washington depended on. And then he's in Philadelphia, right? He spends part of his time in the United States in Philadelphia amidst the revolution, right? He's there at creation. And then after the revolution, he moves down to Charleston. He becomes Deputy Grand Master of South Carolina, right? So he's becoming a respectable member of society. He's a member of the Society of Cincinnati. And so he is this interesting figure. He's involved in really the aspect and creation of the American government, if you think about it. And so it sort of is interesting that he's not only involved in the American government, the formation of the American government, but he's also formation in the Scottish Rite. And that's a really cool, interesting history.
Frederick Dalcho was a different kind of man. Born in London in 1770, the son of a retired officer of Frederick the Great's army, Dalcho came to Baltimore at 17 to study medicine under his uncle, the physician and Freemason, Dr. Charles Frederick Wiesenthal. Dalcho served as a surgeon's mate and then as a lieutenant in the army. He settled in Charleston, where he ran an apothecary alongside his medical practice. He became the secretary of the South Carolina Medical Society. Later in life, he would leave medicine entirely and be ordained as an Episcopal priest.
So for most non-Masons, they know Dalcho, at least locally, as a Episcopalian minister. And he actually wrote one of the early histories of the organization in the state. But for the Scottish Rite, one of the things we do know about Dalcho from surviving records is that, he received the earliest 33rd. We have a patent that confirms that. We also know that he succeeded John Mitchell as Grand Commander. He was very active through his letters and correspondence in keeping the organization afloat, right? Because with this organization, that sort of early couple of decades, it was still in its nascent form. It's certainly not the organization that we have today. And so as the Grand Commander, Dalcho had the responsibility of not only maintaining the records, but keeping this organization afloat, sharing it with others, being able to reach out and create an organization that we have now.
On May 25, 1801, Mitchell conferred the 33rd degree on Frederick Dalcho. Dalcho's patent bears that date, and here, at the very origin of the Supreme Council, the historical record becomes characteristically uncertain. Even Dalcho, who was there, could not or would not say exactly how it all began.
Yeah, the 33rd degree is the great mystery of the Scottish Rite. John Mitchell, again, has received the authority as a deputy in the Order of the Royal Secret. He holds the 25th degree, which is the highest degree. And we know that he confers those degrees on Frederick Dalcho also. Now, in the 1820s, our Grand Commander Moses Holbrook asked Frederick Dalcho, where did Mitchell get the authority for the 33rd degree? And his reply is kind of cryptic. He says that he could not remember, but that he received it from a Prussian or a German who was authorized to communicate it to him, and that he had to sign an obligation in French for it. That's a very cryptic kind of remark to make. So there's been a lot of speculation as to who this person may have been. I personally have a hard time believing that Dalcho didn't know what happened, especially because the earliest evidence we have of a 33rd degree ritual is in his handwriting.
On May 31st, 1801, Mitchell and Dalcho opened the Supreme Council for the first time. From the manifesto they would publish the following year, we know the date and the act. From the rest of the surviving record, we know almost nothing else. There are no minutes of that first meeting. There was no newspaper account. There is no contemporary record confirming the location. No other names are documented as being present that day. The phrase Scottish Rite almost certainly was not used. That name, in fact, would not arrive for several years. By a long-standing tradition, we believe the meeting took place in the building at the corner of Church and Broad Street, originally known as Mr. Shepherd's Tavern. It was where the first Masonic Lodge in Charleston had organized in 1736, and where the Sublime Grand Lodge of Perfection had met until a fire destroyed its records in June 1796. By 1801, the rebuilt structure was a store and a residence, but tradition holds that Mitchell and Dalcho chose that site because of its deep Masonic associations. But the tradition is just that, a tradition. We don't know for a fact that Shepherd's Tavern is where they met.
We're not at all certain that the Supreme Council actually opened for the first time in Shepherd's Tavern. That's a tradition that has seemed to exist with us as far back as we can look. I believe that there were lodges that were meeting, but we don't know that the Supreme Council itself was meeting in that room. Certainly plausible, it would make a lot of sense, but there were a lot of other areas where they could have met.
Whatever room they entered, whatever building stood around them, what was opened that day was unprecedented. A Supreme Council of the 33rd degree, the highest governing body of the Rite, the first of its kind anywhere on Earth. Between May 1801 and August 1802, Mitchell and Dalcho expanded the Supreme Council towards its constitutional limit of 9. Ultimately, 11 men would be counted among the founders. They came from different nations, different faiths, and different trades, but what united them was a shared conviction that this new body was worth building.
We have this perception, right? They worshiped in the same church, they came from the same places, but in fact, that's demonstrably not true. Religious, socioeconomic backgrounds, they had different jobs, they had different levels of education, and so it was through the fraternity, it was through the Scottish Rite, it was through this brotherhood that they were able to find commonality across all these differences.
The first Grand Commander, John Mitchell, died in Charleston on January 25, 1816. The day after his death, his Masonic papers were taken from his widow in 2 trunks by Thomas Becket, Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of South Carolina, and those papers have never been recovered.
Given his importance in the American Revolution, given his importance in the Scottish Rite and in Freemasonry, even in his state, you would think that we have a lot of that detail, but we don't. That said, one of the things that we don't know, and we're still trying to figure out, is where he's laid to rest.
Dr. Frederick Dalcho. Not only was he the first man to receive a patent for the 33rd degree, but he was the first Lieutenant Grand Commander of the Supreme Council and the second Grand Commander. He passed away in Charleston in 1836 and is laid to rest in St. Michael's Churchyard, the same church where he served for many years. Abraham Alexander. Born in London, he arrived in Charleston in 1764 and began service as the leader of Congregation Beth Elohim, the Sephardic synagogue, a position he held for the rest of his life.
Abraham Alexander was also very important to the congregation because he was the service leader. So that was a really important role. He led services for 20 years without pay. They had to make a living other ways. They probably were, most of them were merchants. They had to make their living here and come to the synagogue as a volunteer.
Emmanuel de la Mata. Born in St. Croix in the Danish West Indies of Sephardic Jewish parentage, a commission merchant and an auctioneer in Charleston, and an active member of Beth Elohim congregation.
Emmanuel de la Mata, whom we visited today at Cumming Street Cemetery. His family got kicked out of Spain in 1492. Emmanuel de la Mata was one of the founders of the Hebrew Orphan Society, which was founded to take care of widows and orphans.
Major Thomas Bartholomew Bowen, born in Ireland and served with the Pennsylvania units during the Revolutionary War. He settled in Charleston as a printer. He printed Dalcho's Oration of 1803 and the Annual Register of 1802. He was Grand Master of the ancient Grand Lodge of South Carolina and the first of the 11 gentlemen to pass away in 1805. Israel de Lieben. Born in Prague, Bohemia, he earned his living as a butcher.
When Jewish people visit a cemetery and visit their ancestors, they leave a pebble that just simply says, "I remembered you, and I have come to visit." Flowers die, blow away. We don't bring flowers, generally speaking. We tend to leave a little pebble. And it goes back to biblical days when that's the way gravestones were marked.
This is the man we need to do the most research about it. He was a butcher. He earned his living, but he also volunteered in these various places, in Savannah, in Philadelphia, in Charleston.
Dr. Isaac Auld. Born in Pennsylvania of Scottish Jacobite descent, his family had fled Scotland for France, then sailed to America. A Charleston physician and founder with Frederick Dalcho of the Charleston Botanical Gardens, he and Dalcho were within a few months of each other in age and shared a strong attraction to botany. In January 1802, he was elected to the Supreme Council and would become the third Grand Commander. Comte Alexander Francois Auguste de Grasse. Auguste de Grasse was the only son of the admiral whose fleet had been the deciding factor at the Battle of Yorktown. He was born in 1765. In August of 1793, he fled with his wife and his daughters and his father-in-law Jean-Baptiste Delahogue from the burning of Saint-Domingue to Charleston. He became a naturalized American citizen in 1799 and founded Lodge La Candor with other French refugees.
Although he's not originally looked at in the same light as John Mitchell or Frederick Dalcho, I think de Grasse played an extremely important role in the creation of our Supreme Council. It's not that he was a ne'er-do-well, it's that he was a person who struggled. He had a lot of challenges in his life, but he just kept going. He was a very prolific person. He just continued to try to create and manage as much as he could in Freemasonry. And I think ultimately the success of the Scottish Rite worldwide has a lot to do with him.
Jean-Baptiste Marie Delahogue. He was de Grasse's father-in-law and had spent more than 20 years in Saint-Domingue as an active Mason before the Revolution drove him to Charleston. A manuscript of the 33rd degree ritual, entirely in his handwriting, survives to this day in the Claus collection in the Grand Lodge Library of the Netherlands. He was designated Lieutenant Grand Commander for the French West Indies. Moses Clava Levy. Born in Poland, his middle name Clava honored an uncle who had served as physician to the King of Poland and was decorated with the Order of the Golden Key. He lived in London before migrating to Charleston, where he became the owner of a dry goods store and later served as treasurer and president of Beth Elohim Congregation. He was listed as Treasurer General of the Supreme Council when it was incorporated by the South Carolina legislature in December 1823. Dr. James Moultrie, the only one of the 11 who was born in South Carolina. He followed his father and grandfather in studying medicine at the University of Edinburgh, graduating in 1788. He returned to Charleston to practice medicine, becoming an enthusiastic member of the South Carolina Medical Society and eventually its president. He was the 11th and final founder, and with his admission in August 1802, the roster of the 11 Gentlemen of Charleston, the first Supreme Council, was complete. On December 4th, 1802, a little more than a year after the Supreme Council opened for the first time, it adopted a 7-page report, and that report would become the most important document in the early history of the Scottish Rite.
The circular throughout the two hemispheres was issued on December 4th, 1802, out of Charleston. It's sometimes referred to as the 1802 Manifesto. We believe that it was written by Frederick Dalcho because of the type of language that it uses. There's things that are very reminiscent of his other writings. And it set forth a proclamation to the Masonic world that a Supreme Council had been founded. And it gave a philosophical justification for the creation of the Supreme Council. The first part of the document traces legends in Freemasonry that culminate in the creation of the Supreme Council. And what's curious is, at the end of it, it includes a calendar or a list of degrees, beginning with the entered apprentice degree and finishing with the Supreme Council 33rd. It's divided into sections showing who has authority over each of those parts of Freemasonry.
At the top of its first page, there were 2 Latin inscriptions, translating to God and my right, and order out of chaos. The manifesto was the first time the world heard from the Supreme Council, and not every response was welcoming.
You know, in the earliest history of our Supreme Council, in that early period, the 1800s, this was a very vibrant time in Masonry, not just in the United States, but in the world. And it's important to remember that when we sent our circular to the Grand Lodge of Scotland, the response is that it breathed the spirit of the Illuminati. They didn't like it at all. Their response was that they were always proud to preserve authentic Masonry, entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master Mason. With our Supreme Council, it was really an attempt to preserve the degrees of the Order of the Royal Secret and to assume some kind of singular control.
The Grand Lodge of Sweden became the first foreign body to formally recognize the new Supreme Council. In time, however, recognition spread around the globe. 225 years have passed, and the men themselves are long gone, and nearly everything they left behind has been lost to time.
2 fires that raged in Charleston that basically decimated the archives of the Supreme Council. Add to that a civil war that destroyed the city and made it almost impossible to do business. And so through all those surviving records, Albert Pike, in his first set of transactions for the Supreme Council, admitted, we have very little of this documentation left. And it was through his work and as long with other Masons trying to piece together, it's like sort of like a jigsaw puzzle, trying to figure out where these people came from, who these people were.
The thing is the myth we have to let go of is that these early guys were all together all the time. They weren't. They were like a rock band. Members of rock bands fight all the time. They break apart. They go in their own directions, start their own bands. And we've seen this in early Freemasonry also. But what is remarkable is that in spite of their problems, they saw what the bigger picture was and they supported the project. And that's the success of the Scottish Rite today.
We have a phrase in Hebrew, Lador Vador. It means from generation to generation. If we don't learn from our past, we need to pass everything along to the next generation, or it's lost, it's gone.
There is a legacy and tradition of Scottish Rite that we take very seriously. It's a matter of great pride for us to continue on what those gentlemen started for us.
No minutes survive. No original building stands. We cannot say with certainty what room they entered or what words were spoken. But what they built did not depend on any of those things, because the most important thing they left for us has been passed from brother to brother for over 2¼ centuries. These 11 men from different nations, different faiths, different trades came together with a shared conviction that men could be made better and that a fraternity built on brotherhood was worth governing well. That conviction did not die with those 11 men. That same spirit is present right now in every lodge room, in every Scottish Rite Valley, and in every place where Scottish Rite Masons stand together as brothers with our shared obligations that trace back to the 11 gentlemen of Charleston.
When we make the toasts at festive boards and things like that, or, just a toast at a meeting at the end of the year, I like to always make the one to the gentlemen of Charleston. So the 11 gentlemen, I think their legacy and what we've got a lot of here is one where good folks come together and we have a lasting heritage.